Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I know it's been a while, but, well, life has a way of coming and hitting you right in the face when you least expect it. I'm sure you understand. I did mean to start a schedule of uploading on the weekends, but that doesn't seem really practical with the way my life is right now, so instead, things are going to be more sporadic for a while. I hope you can understand. And if anyone's watched the first two videos and is sticking around for this one, I just want to say I just want to say a big thank you for sticking with me in my sporadic uploads. Your support really warms the cockles of my cold, jaded heart. Well, without any further ado, let's get into today's chapter, shall we? The entire Admiralty Council was gathered around a large table in the conference room on the second floor of the Admiralty building, with one exception, Admiral Raul Cruz, who headed up the Cuban smuggling ring whose front was the Havana Limited Import-Export Group. Cruz was busy at the moment bringing a boatload of trouble back to the island. Isla del Conejo officially had no laws, but officially it also possessed no pirates, and of the laws that it did not formally possess, none were more important than do not bite the hand that feeds you. And by attacking a U.S. ship, Admiral Cruz had done just that. While no official ties existed between any of the three American governments and the Admiralty, all three had made use of the Admiralty's services enough times that they had built what could be called a healthy, working relationship. It was hoped by many of the admirals that a deal like that reached with White Russia could be reached with at least one of the American governments, White Russia having just been granted docking rights and the right to refuel off the coast of the island, as well as having their ships exempt from raiding, in exchange for letting the island do whatever it wanted. While a lot of the admirals were in favor of this, many were also against it, and it had been quite a job for Chuck to dissuade their nerves. He had fought every day in the boardroom of the Admiralty Council until they had all finally agreed with him. And now Cruz had put it all at risk by attacking a U.S. passenger ship.
What is Cruz even doing attacking a ship in the first place?
Asked Admiral Arno Dietrich, who headed up the DKESS, a mercenary company from Germany that had washed up a year or two ago after the failed coup in Berlin, and had quickly taken over one of the seats on the Admiralty Board. The one-eyed German continued,
The Cubana are smugglers, not pirates. They have never raided shipping before, have they?
Chuck felt sick and tired.
I've got no bloody idea, mate. Comrade High Admiral, I believe I can shed some light on the subject.
The answer came from Admiral Nikita Pavlovich Lebezhnov, head of the Moskva Group, a mercenary company from the former USSR that accounted for most of the small number of communists on the island, though precious few of them were ideologically sound anymore. Chuck turned to look at Admiral Lebezhnov, a large, bald man who still dressed in the uniform he'd worn as a colonel in the Spetsnaz. Lebezhnov took a cigarette from his mouth and began to speak.
As you know, my company maintains a sufficient intelligence network.
Chuck had to fight not to laugh at the understatement. The Russians on the island were at least half former KGB agents, and in a city where information was as valuable as here, they were all still up to their old tricks.
We have reasonable information suggesting that in exchange for stopping the ship, they had been offered control of the island by the Beijing government.
His words hung thick in the smoke-filled air, and for a moment there was dead silence, before as suddenly as the room had fallen, it erupted in shouts and curses, loud and blue enough to make the oldest of sailors blush. But among the shouts, one managed to cut through.
And why, High Admiral, did you not know this?
The challenge, for that is what it was, came from none other than Admiral Christopher Barrera. Barrera headed up an outfit that styled themselves Barrera's Raiders. They didn't go in for the type of corporate noms de guerre that the others did. They'd come off the mainland a few years ago when the Chinese rolled into Manila, but despite their Filipino origins, they were more Mongol than near any since Genghis. Even the old Khan had been content to take what he wanted without a fight if possible. But Barrera was a wild dog, and his fleet were fanatically loyal to him. In all honesty, Barrera is the one Chuck would expect to try and take over the island. But Barrera had been in a brutal war with Cruz over drug distribution on the island, so his anger at the notion of Cruz taking over was understandable, if not something that Chuck liked thinking about. But Chuck didn't really care what the Pinoy upstart thought. What he did care about was the other men around the table. If they decided he was unfit to remain as High Admiral, then he'd be out of the job, and the privileges owed to him would disappear. Absent-mindedly, he thought that privilege and power were what he'd come here to escape. Now he had them, however, and he was loath to give them up. But that wasn't what mattered right now. Because, Admiral Barrera, the doings of the individual fleets are the business of their admirals, and nobody else. Would you like for us to know every sordid detail of every shadowy little plan of yours? He knew that some around the table did want things that way, not just where the Filipinos were concerned, but in general. Some of the admirals wanted the council to become a proper government, not just a loose coalition like it was now. In fact, Chuck was among them, but it was unwise to let an opportunity to reassert his dominance over Barrera be wasted. Looking around the table, he saw the looks on the faces of his counterparts, and to his dismay he saw that they were eyeing him with less than pure intentions. He knew he needed to take decisive action or risk losing it all, so he stood and tried his best to look as commanding as possible. It is my view that even in a society such as ours, a society built on the freedom of the fleets and the organizations that have built this society to do as they see fit, there are certain actions which are to be considered taboo. Admiral Cruz has committed a great taboo. So far so good, he thought, as he noted that the men around the table were nodding their heads in agreement. Furthermore, I suggest that if that Cuban bastard wants to tango, then we'll bloody dance. Admiral Frank Kelly, the leader of the Thunder Company, a dangerous lot of killers, terrorists, and fanatics who had fled England after the short-lived BUF government fell, shouted, "Hear, hear!" Kelly was a monster, but his ambitions lay off the island, and for some reason Chuck didn't understand, the fascist had taken a liking to him. Chuck cleared his throat before dropping the A-bomb. I declare the fleet operating under the name Havana Limited and all other companies and enterprises led by the traitor Raul Cruz to be fair game to any on this island, and hereby move to bar him and any other member of his organization from holding a seat on this council. There was dissent. He knew there would be. But his little speech had managed to gain enough support that none lasted long. Barrera was overjoyed at his rival's demise. Lebezhnov and Kelly were willing to back him, and the Vietnamese Lost Army, the name taken by the men who had first settled the island, well, they were usually happy to cast in favor of the winner, desperate to be on the winning side no matter what. Having lost so much of their original power, they didn't fancy losing any more. And besides, they cared little for politics, being much more interested in piracy. The decision had been made. The question was now how to carry it out. Admiral Lebezhnov had suggested an aerial assault by helicopter on the ship that Cruz had hijacked, while Barrera had put forward a plan to simply fall upon them when they disembarked in the harbor and, to quote, put all to the sword. But in the end, the decision was made to arrest them and offer the heads of the men responsible to the United States as a peace offering. Even still, much was to be decided in the particulars, and the meeting dragged on long into the night. As the sun came up the next morning, Chuck stood on a small pier, looking out to sea. Hearing footsteps behind him, he turned to see the broad-shouldered figure of Admiral Willie Crockett. Without a word, the large American took a cigarette from his pocket and offered it to Chuck. "Sunsets right here beautiful, ain't they?" Chuck was surprised by this comment, seemingly coming out of left field, so he only nodded his head and waited for Crockett to go on. "Some of us, the Ruskies and Krauts mostly, my boys too, of course, had been talking." His words hang in the air, and Chuck didn't want to speak. He wasn't sure where this was going, so he simply blew, letting out a large cloud of smoke from his mouth. The silence dragged on still, however, and finally he realized he had no chance but to talk. "About anything in particular?" "Blackie's been getting real comfortable with those Filipino savages." Chuck winced, not because of the racial epitaph. In fact, Minyama Black had chosen the nickname for himself, but instead because Christopher Barrera and Minyama Black were easily the most ambitious men on the island, and if they were plotting together, then things could go wrong for him and the rest of the Admiralty Board very easily. What about? Chuck was worried that he already knew, but he had to hear it himself. Crockett flipped his coffin nail, now nothing but a butt, out into the sea, and with one word turned to leave. "You." Chapter 5. Alan Cody. Alan Cody tramped through the dense Thai jungle, his eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. A few months ago, a communist group called the Thai Red Front had launched a surprise uprising against Thailand, one of the few nations to have been openly friendly to the pirates of Isla del Conejo, and the Thai government had been quick to cash in on its favors. So here he was, sneaking through the jungle. He and his men had been dropped off on the coast by U-boat, or more accurately by an American sub that the German mercs had gotten their hand on, presumably stolen it from a museum given the age of the thing. Just then he heard a noise off in the distance and quickly signaled for his men to halt. With his right hand he raised his pistol, a Webley Mark IV, while with his left hand he fingered a small piece of twisted metal he wore on a chain around his neck. Listening intently, he heard the sound of a helicopter engine getting closer, and as he waved his men off the path, he whispered, "Here we go again." He guessed it was the same Bell UH-1 Iroquois that had been bugging them for the past few hours. He didn't think that they knew he and his men were here, but they sure had been acting as if they did. And it was beginning to worry him. "Stay down!" he shouted as he rolled off the path and into a bush. The Red Front wasn't supposed to have any air support in this area, but the first thing he had learned in Thailand was that the Thai intel was worth about as much as a stick of gum. He still had nightmares about the time he had walked into an ambush outnumbered 3-1 because some Thai experts had been sure that the Red Front was nowhere near their deployment zone. Before too long, the chopper was directly overhead. Alan looked up, shielding his eyes from the flying debris chucked up by the rotor's downwash, and sure enough, there was a big red star painted on the bottom of its fuselage.
"I bloody knew it!"
The shout came from Gazza O'Brien, a tough short guy from some backwater farm in the outback. As the helicopter peeled off, flying back the way it came, Alan picked himself from the ground saying, "Damn Thai intelligence dropped the ball again." The reports from the men were short and profane. Waving them forwards, Alan and his men pushed on. They had been tasked with making their way through the jungle to a Thai Red Front base, where a high-ranking member of the organization was said to be hiding out, and, if they found him, killing him. However, they all had doubts he'd actually be there. As the day dragged on and slowly turned to night, they finally came upon the camp they had been searching for. By this time it was dark, and the decision was made that they would wait until tomorrow so they could judge how many people they were up against in the camp. And so, with that decision, they made camp a little way away from the Red Front base and attempted to get some sleep. A few hours later, Alan was awakened by Frankie Chang, a wiry half-Chinese guy from Sydney he'd known since his days in the Australian Army. It was Alan's turn to take the watch for the next few hours. Taking Chang's place on a log near the edge of the campsite, Alan reached into his pack and removed a thermos bottle of coffee, still slightly warm. It wasn't good. It hadn't even been good when it was hot, but it helped him keep awake during the long hours of his watch, and that's all he really cared about. As those hours dragged on, he found himself thinking about the coming day's events, and as he thought of the odds against them, he shivered slightly in the warm night air. Letting out a long sigh, he said a silent prayer. He wasn't a religious man, never had been, but that old line about atheists and foxholes held true. So he prayed, not to anyone or anything in particular, just prayed. He had the last watch of the night, so in a couple hours, shortly before the sun came up, he awoke his men, and they broke camp. By the time they returned to the base built by the Red Front, the sun was just creeping above the horizon, and he and his men, 5 in total, all members of the South Sea Security Company, spread out and started surveilling the camp. At noon, they all met back together and discussed their findings. The base housed around 50 men, not counting non-combatants. After some discussion, they decided that the best way to go about the assault would be to create a distraction at the far end of the camp, and while the revolutionaries were distracted, they would sneak into the camp, find their target, who they believed was in the Central Command building, a somewhat large wooden hut. Frankie Chang, who was the squad's demolition expert, was assigned to cause the distraction, and so he slipped off into the woods with his bombs. The rest of the group sat still and waited for the blast. An hour passed in silence before crack! The sharp sound of explosives hit their ears, and the camp collapsed into chaos, with men running around like headless chickens trying to figure out what happened. In the midst of the confusion, their target, General Zhao, a Chinese national, or so the reports said, and the leader for the TRF in this region, poked his head out of the command hut. Having positively identified their target, he and his men rushed forwards and surrounded the building. Kicking in the door, they breached the hut with weapons raised and cornered General sitting at his table. The Chinese communist, fighting to liberate Thailand, stood and calmly began to speak, saying, "I am sure we can," when suddenly he was cut off by O'Brien shoving his knife through the Red General's throat. The man coughed and spat blood as he collapsed in a heap on top of his desk, a crimson pool spreading out from his neck. Alan bent over to feel for a pulse, and after confirming the target was dead, turned to Gaza O'Brien and said, "Awful rude. You could have at least let the dirtbag finish speaking." Gaza only grunted as he put his knife back into its sheath. Suddenly, from the corner of the room, behind a curtain that hid what counted for a bedroom in the command hut, came an awful, blood-curdling scream as a woman lunged at Gaza with a cruel-looking knife in her hand. Before anybody had time to react, she had sunk it into Gaza's before anybody had time to react, she had sunk it deep into Gaza's tender flesh. In a single swift motion, Gaza brought his knife up and slashed it across her throat. And as she collapsed, in a single swift motion, Gaza brought his knife up and slashed it across her throat, the blood draining from her face as she collapsed bonelessly. Clutching his wound, Gaza spat, "Steph's right," before he himself collapsed. Rushing to his side, Alan began to examine his wounds, and to his relief, he found them to be non-life-threatening. However, Gaza was looking pale, even as he chuckled and said, "Oh, stop fussing like an old hen, will ya?" Suddenly, a shouted curse rang out from Tommy Lang, the broad-shouldered former professional footy player who had been left to guard the door. Looks like the Reds heard him scream, sir." And as he turned to look, Alan Cody saw it to be true. The small building had been surrounded by heavily armed members of the Thai Red Front. The air was oddly still for a few moments. Everybody just stood and looked at each other. Soon, however, the spell was broken, and a shot rang out from the Red Front, and the camp descended into chaos once again. Gunshots ringing out all across the small valley where the camp had been built. The sound of gunshots rang all around the small valley where the camp had been built. "Get down!" the cry came from Alan Cody's lips, though it was not entirely necessary. Without thinking, he slipped his Webley revolver back into his holster and pulled from his back a bullpup Ostire rifle, a souvenir from his days taking Canberra's coin. Taking aim down the sights of his rifle, he let out a burst, which with a single trigger pull felled two of their assailants. The other mercs in his squad were also firing into the crowd of communists. Even Gaza was taking pot shots with his pistol. It didn't take long for the soldiers of the TRF to realize they would do better to get behind cover, and so they scattered to the four winds, taking shelter behind vehicles, other buildings, fallen logs, and anything else they could find. For nearly an hour, the two groups exchanged sporadic fire, with the Red Front taking heavy casualties, but they still greatly outnumbered Alan's squad of mercenaries, who were by this point running dangerously low on ammunition. When suddenly a cry rose from the attackers. Alan didn't speak Thai, but he got the feeling that whatever had been said was bad for him. Alan did not speak Thai, or whatever the man was speaking, but still he got the feeling that whatever it was bad for him and his men. And he was right. Suddenly the Reds started rushing forwards from all sides. "It's a charge!" came a shout from somebody, he wasn't sure who in the heat of the moment, and within a second the air was filled with the sound of gunshots and the screams of injured men.
The air was thick with smoke and the smell of blood. After what seemed like hours, but in reality could only have been a few minutes at most, the charge broke, and the Thai communist fell back to cover. Alan breathed deeply, and then looked around to see if any of his men were still all right. By some miracle, nobody had been hurt, but Gaza O'Brien was looking much worse than he had been before the charge, and had clearly lost a lot of blood from the knife wound. Alan Cody made his way over to Gaza through a mountain of spent shell casings. As he examined his wounded comrade, Tommy Lang was looking around in the back of the shack when he called out in happy surprise. Boss! Boss, there's a crate of AKs back here! Alan felt a small glimmer of hope when he inquired as to whether there was any ammunition, and the answer returned in the affirmative. Well, pass 'em out. Each man gets a rifle and as much ammunition as makes sense, he shouted as he stood and grabbed a Kalashnikov off the top of the pile. With it, taking it in hand, he began to feed rounds out of a nearby ammo crate into the banana clip, when suddenly the same damned shout rose from the red lines, and the human wave began rushing forwards again. Well, they don't lack for bravery, Lang said, oddly calm, as he returned to the window where he had been firing from earlier. Alan likewise retook his position and began firing into the oncoming wave of revolutionaries. Again the air grew thick and close as the repeated firing of rifles engulfed them. Bullets cracked all around them as the Thai communist returned fire as they charged. Bruce Callahan, one of the blokes in the squad, cried out in pain as a splinter the size of a carrot embedded itself into his arm, and a sickening cry rose as Alan saw a young Red Front trooper collapse to the ground, clutching at his crotch, a red stain growing on his pants. Finally, the communists, who had been reduced in number to only 10 men, fell back into cover. Suddenly the mercenaries heard the sound of a .50 caliber machine gun barking to life with a roar comparable to the walls of Jericho coming down around their pagan inhabitants. And the 10 surviving Reds were quickly turned to a fine red mist, even as they tried to flee. The hell? Lang shouted as he recovered from the shock of the moment. A moment later came the sound of an engine coughing to life, and an honest-to-God Toyota Hilux Technical sprang into view, complete with a mounted machine gun. Sitting behind the wheel, smoking a cigarette, was now quite disheveled-looking Frankie Chang. Need a ride, mate? He asked, slightly out of breath. Alan stood and looked dryly at the demolitions expert. Couldn't have brought this a few minutes ago. Frankie only smiled and said, mate, you know I hate work. Turning back to the shack, he waved his men towards the truck, telling them to load O'Brien, now barely conscious, into the bed of the truck. Telling them to load O'Brien, now barely conscious, into its bed. As he stood there, he began to look around at the carnage. He had caused. Around the hut on all sides lay bodies. Their initial count had been 50 combatants, but the number of dead was clearly higher. He figured they had armed the cooks, radio operators, and hookers that were necessary to keep any righteous revolution running. Walking over to the window of the truck, Alan took a cigarette from a pack in his pocket and lit it off a Chang's, already smoldering coffin nail, before turning and walking towards a building with a lot of satellites and antennas covering it. "Where you going, boss?" Chang called out. Without turning around, Alan shouted back that he had to make a call. Pistol in hand, he entered the radio shack and found it abandoned. Picking up the handset of a two-way radio, He tuned it into a frequency that they had been told to use to contact the Thai government. About a minute later, he exited the building and returned to his comrades.
"What was that about?"
asked Chang, looking up from where he'd been tending to Gaza. From where he'd been tending to Gaza O'Brien's wounds with a first aid kit.
"Oh, nothing,"
Alan Cody replied. "Oh, nothing," replied Alan, coyly causing.
"Oh, nothing,"
replied Alan, coyly, causing Tommy Lang to laugh and tell him to spit it out, which Cody refused. As the men were preparing to make tracks, a noise came from back inside the hut, and suddenly a figure darted out from the door, knife in hand, making a beeline for Alan Cody. Acting purely on reflex, Cody snatched his pistol from its holster and fired off a shot in the direction of his attacker. The attacker crumpled as the bullet ripped through the tender flesh of one of their small legs. The mysterious assailant let out a long, anguished cry, like that of a wounded animal. Stepping closer to the body, Alan prepared to deliver the coup de grace when a shout came from the truck.
"Bloody hell, he's just a Joey! Bloody hell, he's just a Joey!"
Alan stopped short and took a long look at the wounded child on the ground in front of him. He realized with a small pang of horror that his attacker had in fact been a child. Alan Cody stooped down to look the kid in the eyes, and the kid spat in his face. This was enough to start his mercenary band erupting with laughter. However, Alan calmly wiped his face and looked again at the kid.
Murderer!
Shouted the kid as he tried to strike Alan, succeeding in hitting his shin but failing to have any effect. Alan had a stern look on his face, asking the kid if he spoke any English besides the word murderer. The kid replied,
Yes!
and said that he had been a translator for the Red Front. Alan nodded, asking, "What are your parents in this group?" The boy nodded, defiant tears in his eyes.
Yes, the General. I see you and your... Yes, the General.
I see. You and your mother. She was the woman who... I see. And your mother? She was the woman who attacked my man? The boy began to sob, having lost the strength to do anything else. Looking at his leg, Alan saw he was losing blood quickly. "Look, boy," Alan said, "I'm going to give you two options. We can leave here, and I promise you that you will die. We can take you with us, and you might live. No telling, really." The boy looked up at Alan with fearful tears in his eyes. He didn't say a word, but after a few seconds he nodded. Alan stood up, roughly grabbing the boy by the back of his shirt, and plopped him into the back of the Technical. Climbing in two, he banged on top of the truck and shouted for Chang to floor it, and the truck tore out of the compound down a rough jungle road. As they bumped down the path, Alan went about giving the boy first aid treatment, tying a tourniquet and giving the boy a shot of a painkiller with an unpronounceable name. As he did, the boy sort of faded off into a trance. All the better for him, Alan thought, not wanting to think of what was going through the kid's head. Overhead, he heard a roar as two Thai Air Force F-16s streaked overhead, followed moments later by a colossal explosion as they bombed the hell out of the bones of the Red Camp, setting a light to General Zhang's funeral pyre.